Hi, folks. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about at what point, is there a point in time, modern times, when the middle class ceased to be viable? And I'll come back to sort of definitions of what a middle class might be, but in a material and financial sense. And we'll see at what point did that decline begin. But just to set a few sort of markers in place, and if I look at the statistics from the the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they claim that the average wage in Australia is $110,000 to $115,000 a year. This is Australian dollars. So okay, that's the average. Now the median is a little bit lower, but not much. Now let's have a look at with that in mind. So $110,000 a year. That's the average. Let's say the median is 100. So now let's go to the bigger job board sites, advertising jobs, and then look at the amount of jobs that pay that sort of money, because it's going to bring in a big pool around the middle, you would say. So, but out of all the jobs advertised on the job board, only about a little over 20% pay either $100,000 or more. Now, depending on which day, there might be a bit of variance, but you don't get more than 25% of the jobs advertised. Now, if you go into certain categories, you can bump that up. Say you go into rocket science or something, they get paid more than the average. But clearly, the great bulk of jobs pay a lot less than the average. Now, you have to even at $50,000 a year income, which is supposedly half this average. It's still more jobs in that category than there are in any other category, as in income category. So if the average is indeed, I'll just round it off to even numbers. If the average is indeed $100,000 a year, then, and given the vast number of people who make way less than that, then that must mean there's a very small group at the top that are making gazillions, and that it artificially inflates the average point, or indeed the median point. So the majority of jobs by far, I'm looking at a regional city here, and the amount of jobs that pay $100,000 and more represent 6% of the jobs. So clearly there's something wrong with the claim. Now, this is the thing with statistics and how the globalists, I think, have altered it for whatever their reasons are. If I go back to, say, 1994, and I look at the average wage or median wage, doesn't really matter, and they were quite close together at the time. And then I go into look at the average wage that was, say, advertised in the employment newspaper, because this was sort of kind of pre-internet, really. If I look at the employment newspapers, then the average that's claimed by the Bureau of Statistics back in 1993-4, and the average that would appear from the job adverts and newspapers, they're very close. They're about the same. There's not a whole lot in it. But today it's quite different. The average wages claimed by the Bureau of Statistics is far higher than would be suggested by the jobs that are advertised online. Now, how can that be? That doesn't seem to make sense. There's a few other differences. If you look at the average wage for, say, government employees, public servants, even senior public servants, you look at the average wage for people working in the NGO sector, the charity sector, the wages there were quite a bit lower than the private sector. In the NGO sector, they were seriously entry-level type wages. Now you look at that today, and government employees, quangos and NGOs, they're the best paid jobs you can get in Australia now. If you're looking at a manufacturing manager for a large factory, or the the vice president of manufacturing in the factory, they'll be paid a quarter, less than a quarter of what a senior public servant be paying. They'll be paid less than a 3-day-a-week political agitator for an NGO gets, out of their office in a university somewhere. So there's been a huge realigning. Productive jobs, actual productive jobs, are paid much less than ideological jobs now, and that's a big difference from how it was again in the early 90s. But this is about the time. So now you look at say the average wage. Now back in the day, those days I was being paid 6 or 7 times, 6 times say the average wage. But if you look at the average wage and a house price, so we'll look at the average house price. This assumes a freestanding house, like a 3-bedroom freestanding house. But if you look at the house price, say in 1994, the average house price, and then the average wage, the average house price, give or take, was about 7 times. And this is not out in the sticks or something. This is like in a middle distance suburb that's close to shops and transport, that sort of thing. And that would have been, give or take, about 7 times the average wage. So if the average wage was 35,000, the average house price there was say 220,000, around that. So you're looking at, give or take, 6-7 times, that type of thing. Now today, if you look at even if you assume the average wage is 100,000, which I dispute, but even if you assume it is, then that same house is now 2.2 million. So it's now 20, 21, 22 times the average wage to buy that house. Even if you assume 2 average wages, you're still looking at 11 times as opposed to 6 or 7 times in the mid-90s. So you see this drift of the cost of living, and this applies to rent and or servicing a mortgage, the cost of living increasing at a much faster rate than wages are increasing. So for people wanting to buy houses and that sort of thing, you couldn't do it on, or already by 1996, 97, that the differential between wage growth and house price. So a house that you would have bought in for say 200,000 in 1990, even by 1997, was already approaching 400,000. So it's nearly doubled in 7 years, whereas wages had gone up by 15% or something over that time. So now, if you look at also the other added costs of increasing local council rates, the increasing cost of gas and electricity, these sort of things already on the move as well. So the middle class. How do you identify or define a middle class? Well, middle class is the ability to improve their socioeconomic circumstances, whether that's through rigorous education or ass-busting hard work or whatever it might be, but that ability to improve their situation, or to live, play the long game and live frugally today for the benefits to be reaped tomorrow. Now, at this same time, divorces are going through the roof and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of changes going on. Women entering the workforce, so there's the middle class sort of got an artificial survival kit because women were entering the workforce and having fewer children, and therefore there were 2 household incomes, and this temporarily artificially offset the idea of the declining middle class. But if you can't have children and you've got a 50% chance of getting divorced, you're not having children, having fewer children, then I would argue that the middle class is already on a downward trajectory just from that alone. But the idea that a single income earning male could afford to buy a modest, nothing fancy, modest house in a middle distance suburb and have 2 or 3 children and have just a basic, mass-produced motor vehicle, this sort of thing. That was the definition of the growing, booming, prosperous middle class. Now, were they prosperous in the sense of having waterfront property or top-of-the-range Beamers or having lavish overseas trips? Well, no, but they were improving. Each day went by, their situation was materially better, and they had a better standard of living than was the previous case, and they could look to the future with optimism. They could afford to bring children into the world and feed them and clothe them and this sort of thing. That was the middle class. Now the working classes, you sort of have a bit of a spread across the working class. The working class who had no hope, no future, no optimism, no promise about tomorrow, and you had the upper end of the working class that say, which could be, for example, a tradesman. But they may be getting a lot of work. They may be, they could improve their situation by working longer hours, working weekends, all sorts of things like that. So they could become de facto middle class, maybe not in a cultural sense of having good manners and this sort of thing, but at least economically, and be able to look to the future with some sort of optimism. Now that all changed at around that time. That time window there was when that was when the downward trajectory was sort of baked in, set in stone and set in concrete, and the downward trajectory continued from that point onwards. So other than people who'd bought their houses sort of in the 1960s and owned them outright by the time the property prices were going hysterical, other than those sort of people, pretty much everyone missed out. And given the attendant social dislocation and these sorts of things, then the middle class was destroying itself. And this destruction came from women entering the workforce, the entitlement, affirmative action programs. Already then women were being handed affirmative action degrees and qualifications and so on. And already then it was quite clear. I remember looking at the businesses around at the time, which I thought was just a momentary aberration, not realizing it was a trend. And many American-owned companies were aggressively, hiring gay, lesbian, and people, and putting women in key roles who weren't even minimally qualified to be in those roles. That I noticed that around that time, and it took me by surprise. But anyway, that was the decline of the middle. At that point, that was when it was again obvious and manifest the middle class was in decline. I'm talking about Australia here. I think America had a wider spread of sort of smaller cities where there still was affordable real estate and still decent employment opportunities. Austin, Texas, places like that. I don't know what they're like today, but this was in Australia. This was the difference, and even looking at it back now with a lot of hindsight, I didn't quite appreciate at the time how the middle class was being destroyed and how they were going to be. United Kingdom and middle class means you're rich, but you're not an aristocrat. Whereas middle class in Australia means you are economically and socially mobile. So it's a slightly different definition. I think the Australian definition, the American definition of middle class are probably closer than the English definition. But that was the middle class going into irreparable and unrecoverable decline, and I would argue it happened at around that time. And hopefully the administration of President Trump can bring it back, because the destruction of the middle class was not just some casual accident of history. Far from it. I believe that the aggressive divorce machinery, the bringing women into the workforce simply for ideological reasons, the handing out of affirmative action degrees and qualifications, all this sort of thing was part of what was the middle class. Even just at the end of the 1990s, one of the big international financial magazines, one of the guys came, I think he was the editor or something like that, came and did a speaking tour in Australia, and I was very surprised at his attitude. which was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but in effect was, look, it's now a globalized world. You working class white people are now competing with brown and black peasants from all over the world. So your standard of living is going to go down. That's it. Don't like it, too bad. Suck it up. And if you want to arrest this decline in standard of living, then you have to work 40% more hours, or accept a 40% decline in your standard of living. But the decline of standard of living is much, much greater than that. The purchasing power of the average wage today versus the purchasing power of the average wage in any time before that sort of mid 1990s period was a huge difference. I pointed out that it's an average. It takes 22 years of an average wage to buy a house. This is just an ordinary 3-bedroom middle suburban house, by the way. This is nothing fancy. It takes 22 years of gross. This is pre-tax gross income to buy a house, whereas it took 6.5 years or so in the time of the early mid 90s, and that's the staggering difference that we're talking about here, and that's the hole that the middle class has disappeared into, and it's been, again, I would argue that it's orchestrated. In effect, the globalization program is very expensive, and really it's been stolen from the wealth. The money to do it has been stolen from the wealth of the white middle class of the West. You've been with Tassif today, your Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.